everyone for joining today's webinar, and at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Bill.
Great, thanks, Michelle. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to HBK's monthly risk advisory webinar series. My name is Bill Heaven. I'm a senior director here at HBK. In our risk advisory practice, I have a dual role where I work both internally doing IT security as well as working externally with clients. This morning, we're going to talk about the importance of an annual risk assessment. And I know some of you may remember we did a similar topic a few months back, but risk assessments are very important. And so I wanted to highlight the topic, and I've solicited the help of two experts that are in our HBK Vertilocity practice, and they're going to help me this morning. Justin and Chris, I'll introduce them to you in just a couple minutes and let them give some background on themselves. But this morning, I'll go through some housekeeping issues. So here's our agenda that we're going to talk about today. And just to let everybody know, this is kind of similar. I do this every month, but we've muted all the incoming lines. And if you do experience problems, you can either refresh your browser as your first choice, or we are monitoring the message control center. So you could type us Q&A, comments, questions there, and we can address your concerns and help you the best we can. And we're going to strive to leave a few minutes at the end of today's webinar to ask questions. So if you can tee up the questions for us in the Q&A, and most likely we'll answer them at the end. But if it's a very content sensitive question, we can stop and address your question right there. But typically we queue them up for the end. Also, there's a PDF copy of today's presentation that's in the meeting control center that you can use, and then today's webinar is being recorded. So if you want to get it to a colleague or anything, we will be sending it out automatically, probably within 2 to 3 days of the webinar airing. It'll have a copy of the slide deck as well as a link to get to the recording. And again, we're going to cover the above agenda. I'm not going to reread it for you. But at this time, I'm going to turn things over to Justin, and he can give probably a better introduction of his and Chris's background. So without further ado, Justin.
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate it. Yeah, I think you said two experts. Let's call it 1.5. I think Chris is really the security expert here. But again, my name is Justin Krentz. I'm Principal of Business Development here at Vertilocity. So my focus is more account management, new business, right, strategy, budget. So I'm more involved on the business side of the house, where Chris Bowman, who is our Director of IT Services, he's really the expert here. So I appreciate the pat on the back there, Bill, but Chris Bowman is truly the expert from our standpoint, and appreciate you having us here today. So, and with that, we'll just jump right into the purpose, right? So, what exactly is the purpose of a risk assessment? So, here's a quick list of items that you should be discovering or really uncovering through this process. But you want to look at a couple key things here, right? So, identifying threat sources. So, what are the different threats that are out there right now that could be potentially, attacking your business? Ransomware, phishing, socially engineered attacks, spyware, right? It's becoming a longer and longer list. So being able to identify those. Identifying the threat events, right? So what happens if one of these threat sources gains access, right? How is that going to affect? How are they going to act within your environment? So being able to identify and define that. Identifying the vulnerabilities. So, this is more, in relation to potential gaps, in your network, right? So where are the blind spots? Being able to, again, map that out and have that down, is a critical function of the assessment. determining the likelihood of an exploitation, right? So based off of vulnerabilities, within the environment, threat sources, threat events, how likely are you? Are you low risk? Are you high risk for an attack to be successful? Determining impact, right? So that's just more so how much disruption will you face if a threat occurs? So if all of these things align, they get past your defense, right? Your security, what does that look like in terms of impact to business or operations? And then the last piece is just, calculating risk, as a combination of those, right? So I think it's important to keep in mind that, having a high impact rating could make a risk a top priority, even if it has a low likelihood of happening, right? So if it's, hey, there's very minimal chance that this happens, but if it does, we are in serious trouble, or we're seriously exposed, or we've got sensitive data that will be compromised, that puts us in a very precarious situation, right? That's going to take priority over something that maybe has more of a chance of happening, but again, less of an impact to the organization. So it's important to kind of understand that matrix, right? In, as it relates to your specific business. So, I mean, it really all starts with a framework, right? So, first you really want to establish a common language so that different departments, different divisions, different individuals within the organization are really all playing by the same rules, right? And measuring against, the same frameworks and standards. This is critical because this way, everybody is utilizing the same controls, the same terminology. There's no confusion amongst the various, units within an organization. Oh, I thought this terminology meant this. I thought we were benchmarking and framing against that, right? Having a common language that everybody's, agreed to and is on the same page with. And it's also really important to have standards and guidelines and best practices that are not only clearly defined, but really are flexible and repeatable. They need to be flexible because I think, as all of us are aware at this point, right, technology is ever changing. It's very fast paced. What was relevant to the business 3 months ago, 30 days ago, in some cases, is no longer relevant, or it's already outdated. And being able to repeat it, because this isn't a one-time kind of engagement. This is something that you want to do, to some degree on a recurring cadence, right? So that, again, you're updating this information, you're staying in front of relevant attacks, you understand your risk assessment based on changes to the organization, right? Groups change size, they change footprint, they go into other geographic spaces, work from home versus working in the office versus hybrid, right? Everybody's aware of all the changes. So it's really important to have standards, again, being flexible and repeatable. Really this framework essentially should help communication from technical to non-technical individuals within the organization, right? This really needs to span company-wide rather than just focus on a specific group. So you want to make sure that the language and framework is relevant and can be understood, across the board, essentially. So that, again, there is no confusion. There's high level of adoption, in a working relationship with all functions of the organization.
Yeah, Justin, I would totally concur with that before we get to the CPE question here for everybody. But I think when you said that it makes it repeatable, I mean, I can't stress that enough. And I would probably add in there that it gives you what you also said about consistency. So when we're doing these risk assessments from year to year, we can see, are we getting better, or is our risk exposure, better or worse? And so the framework allows you to do that as well. So I think those are some very key points that you made.
Absolutely, Bill. Being able to benchmark, right, and understand where you were 12, 24, 36 months ago versus now. Have you been able to close those vulnerabilities and gaps that you can then recognize and present and speak to, and be able to use that, again, going forward for further assessments, right, as the environment changes. So yes, that's a critical component.
Great. Yeah, thanks. For those of you that are looking for CPE on today's webinar. Like I said before, we are offering CPE, so you have to stay around for the entire presentation and answer 4 questions that are going to pop up, of which you're looking at the first one. So for those of you that want CPE, go ahead and answer that question. And Michelle, when it looks like everybody's had a chance to answer, you could go ahead and just forward the slide so we can keep going, and I'll turn it back over after the question to Justin and Chris. All right. So
Perfect.
it looks like we're right back to you, Justin.
Wonderful, wonderful. And just one more quick slide here from my aspect, really to sum things up. As to the why, right? Cybersecurity risk assessment. Really, it's an all-encompassing review of not only your technology, but also employees, processes, policies in place, right, that allow you to really identify and prioritize your information security risks, right? It's not a singular focus in technology in terms of, hey, what infrastructure do we have? What security applications are we using? It's a much deeper dive into, well, how are we accessing data? Who is accessing data? What's the policy for onboarding, for deboarding, right? All of these kind of components, right, are what make up your risk and your posture, from a cybersecurity standpoint. So I think it's critical to also note that this is encompassing staff, this is encompassing processes, policies, and technology, right? Certainly technology is a key factor in this, but it's not the only factor. So with that, I will now hand things over to Chris Bowman to speak more to the technical aspects.
Sure. And the critical thing to figure out when you're doing a risk assessment is, okay, what am I actually measuring? It does very little good to try to assess risks without defining that first. And since we're focusing on specifically cyber risks, it's really going to start out with a network assessment. And in a network assessment, you're going to review and inventory what are your internal systems. What are the applications that you rely upon? What are the machines that run within your network? Are there servers that are critical systems? Or do we have an actual list of these are the computers in our system? Understand how mobile devices are connecting into your system, and really build out a knowledge and a map of, this is the network that we have, these are the systems that we use. Because without that foundational understanding of, this is our system, this is what we use, this is what's critical to the business to be working, and this is where our data lives, you really don't have a way to measure where the risks are. So the first critical step is doing a network assessment and understanding what is our environment. Network assessment is also going to include a backup and recovery plan, in which we define, okay, so we've now identified what systems are critical, what information needs to be protected. The next question is going to be, how do we back that up? So if there is an outage of a system, how are we protecting against data loss? How are we protecting against a ransomware attack? How are we protecting against a server that fails? And if that does happen, what is the plan around restoring those services? A network assessment needs to include employee roles, understanding who is in charge of what aspects of the network and the data within the network, who's managing that, who controls access, and coordination with HR, so that employees aren't just getting access to information on a one-off basis. If every aspect of business information should have a control built around it where an employee's role defines whether or not they can connect to it. Can open up a file, see a file share, access a system. Another aspect of a network assessment is going to be system stability. Defining truly the criticality of a system and determining, is it worth our effort to make sure that this system has a higher guaranteed uptime. Some systems may be something that's only really used, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. and there can be substantial cost savings for scheduling it to only be available during those times. Some systems are truly mission critical and can't tolerate downtime at all, and defining whether it is in the organization's interest to make sure that there are additional functionalities in place so that if there's a server down or if there's a software glitch, that the system will continue to function in the event of something like that. And so it's crucial to define, what are our goals with system stability, and how from there you can define, how do we accomplish those goals. Another major component of a network assessment is the use policies. So defining what behaviors employees are permitted while they're using company assets and company network. Things like internet usage policy, defining what is and isn't allowed as far as using company assets for personal work, defining what company policy is for users bringing their own devices. It's become a big issue with multi-factor authentication, especially where companies have employees that don't have corporate issued mobile devices, but the organization is now in a position where they need to ask those users to use multi-factor authentication on their mobile devices. So it's become a huge issue of defining when users are allowed to use personal devices, when they're required to use personal devices, and establish policies around things like that, so that you truly have an understanding of what is being used in your system and the potential risks of that. The next step is going to be a security assessment, defining attack surfaces, which is really anything that a user can access is essentially an attack surface. So it's a potential way that somebody could get into the system and could potentially exploit the network. It's a tricky thing to define and identify all of your attack surfaces, because there's truly there's a lot of them in any network. But it is important to identify what are the risks of this attack surface if it should be exploited. It can be anything from a user's workstation, especially if they're taking it from home, can certainly potentially be compromised, to the user logs into webmail, and that is a potential entry point for a malicious user, and just identifying what those surfaces are and what could be exploited. Points of entry, again, that's a type of attack surface that is specifically allowing remote connectivity into the organization from outside. And those points of entry, VPNs, remote management tools, remote desktop tools, web portals, all need to be very carefully scrutinized to identify, what controls are built around them, and if if they were to be exploited, what level of access would that give, so that we can define the risk of that point of entry, and then, if appropriate, take action to better control that point of entry. Security assessment should also review user habits in the organization. One of the things we've seen many times is users sharing account information among themselves, and that's, any cybersecurity expert will tell you that is a huge problem if an organization has that going on, because it becomes impossible to audit who was actually doing what in the event of a cyber incident. And it becomes a major gap where, especially if you have a user who has left the organization that maybe was disgruntled, or you have a user who was somewhat careless in some way and shared their account information outside of the organization, that can be a very simple vector for somebody to get into the network from outside and just cause all sorts of concerns from a security standpoint. Security assessment should always include a review of policies. What are our security policies in the organization? Are they in line with industry best practices? Are there gaps? Are we covering in our policies all of the gaps identified? Gaps, attack surfaces, points of entry, user behaviors. Are we identifying those in our security policies and making policies around the appropriate things to protect the organization? HR procedures, again, HR should play a role in IT security, and that permissions for users should be defined by their job role and their need for access. So HR needs to be involved in defining the security of the organization, and also HR procedures around asset retention. When an employee is let go, what is the policy for returning their equipment? Things like that need to be defined in an organization's HR procedures and policy, so that there aren't questions when an employee is let go, and it's a simple, straightforward process to separate from them without incurring risk to the company. Another major point of a security assessment is: are there any legal impacts or implications? Are there aspects of the organization that are required to have documentation for security, or documentation around auditing of user activity, or things like that? Certainly in the financial world, many organizations are required to comply with FINRA policies. In the medical organization, many organizations are required to comply with HIPAA or high tech. And there's a number of legal requirements and legal impacts that need to be part of the security assessment to ensure that the organization is compliant and protecting against the legal implications of not being compliant.
Hey, Chris, just real quick on that user habits part, you were talking earlier about like work from home. Are you seeing a lot where, users are putting the kids to bed and working from like 10 p.m. till 2 or 3 in the morning, and it kind of resets everything so you can't? There used to be that thing called like the Superman user, where somebody got their credentials hacked and they were logging in the US, and Europe at, within 5 minutes. Are you kind of seeing that stuff on your end with the remote working?
So we've seen, we've certainly seen with remote working that users are working at different times. There has been some of that impossible travel, especially users who are using things like private personal VPN. A user may connect to a VPN that's in, say, Norway, and then try to work. And certainly, we've seen some of that. There's certainly risks associated with allowing that sort of impossible travel. And a lot of organizations, we've been discussing blocking traffic from, unapproved countries. We have a lot of clients that are saying, I want to limit my employees' ability to remotely access to, say, only the United States, or I may have an outsourced group in another country, say India, that I want to allow them access, but not other countries like, say, Russia, China, North Korea are commonly want to be blocked. And we're seeing a lot more controls being developed by security equipment providers as well, built around that, where geo-blocking is a real possibility, certainly in the Microsoft suite of products, and firewall and VPN providers as well are all developing geo-blocking solutions to help with that.
Interesting. Yeah. So basically, there's new tools being developed, but you also have to look at the stuff so you have a baseline to evaluate from. So
absolutely.
Thanks.
Sure. The next step after doing a security assessment is to do a vulnerability assessment, where you review the risks of the applications and systems within your organization. Application flaws, frequently there are patches deployed by software vendors for known vulnerabilities in their applications. And what we've seen with a lot of line of business applications is once they're deployed, the tendency is to just leave them alone and very, very rarely perform patching and updates. And that is something we've had to push a large percentage of clients towards, is maintaining an update cadence on those. And when patches come out, especially, a lot of times we've seen a software vendor publish what's called a 0-day patch, where an unknown vulnerability, sometimes a very major vulnerability with the application, was discovered in the wild, and the vendor had to then develop a solution to that. From day 0, they were developing a solution, and you might be 13, 14 days out before the vendor actually has a patch. And so they typically will publish mitigations that you can do in the meantime and then develop patches, but it's very important to be monitoring that and to be planning to deploy those patches as soon as they become available, because they can be significant risks to the organization. But it's important to periodically review applications and make sure that those patches have in fact been deployed and you are running on the latest patch versions. Operating system flaws, really the same thing. Operating systems are just a application that runs a computer's hardware, and very critical at the operating system level, because it has so much control over everything in the environment, in the machine and in the environment. Maintaining patching, typically patches are deployed on a monthly basis, and it's very important, especially on anything that's internet facing or that has regular user interaction, to make sure that those operating systems are getting patched every month. Computer system flaws. This is actually becoming a bigger threat where there are simply design limitations within a computer where there's an exploit that's possible just built into the equipment. And we saw with a few years back, there was a lot of media press about things like Spectre and Meltdown, where information could actually be extracted from the hardware of a machine because of the way it was designed. So reviewing those system flaws and determining, is there a mitigation that can be done? Is it time to replace a machine because there's not a mitigation available? And understanding and taking those into account. And a lot of times it is, unfortunately at this point, we simply have to acknowledge the risk is there, and we're waiting for vendors to develop solutions for it, and mitigate the risk in any way that we can. Knowing that the vulnerability is there. There should always be a review of open ports, open services, and processes that are allowed to run in the environment, especially as organizations start to become larger and more complex. There needs to be real control over who is allowed to run what on their systems, and make sure that, especially when old software is deprecated, that it is actually removed from systems and not simply left there, because that's often when unpatched vulnerabilities become a problem. Databases, is the database configured according to best practices? Is it accessible from outside? And is it encrypted? Human error is always a big challenge, but certainly if we can identify ways that humans are likely to have errors in the environment, we can start building controls around them.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And then for those wanting CPE, here's our second checkpoint question. So go ahead and answer that. And Michelle, let me know when. Looks like we've got the number that we're expecting based on the first question, and we'll pick it back up with Chris. All right, Chris, back to you.
Okay. Any risk assessment should include a dark web assessment. We tend to think of the internet, the World Wide Web that we see every day, web pages like Amazon and our business business web pages as the internet, but there's actually a lot that goes on underneath. And what is most interesting to us in this assessment is basically web forums and servers where basically hackers exchange information that they've stolen from organizations, either for bragging rights or for money. What dark web monitoring services do is crawl through these web forums looking for, is there information from your organization that has been stolen? And there's nothing you can really do about the fact that the information is out there, but you can certainly see that, hey, the credentials from this user, or 100 credentials from our domain have been stolen and they're available for sale. We need to go through and make sure that passwords have been reset, review to see how the hacker may have gotten in and gotten access to that data. So it's not a preventative measure in that you can't prevent the data from that's already out there from being stolen, but it is crucial to close whatever gaps existed and make sure that those gaps are not going to continue to be a problem. Next, I want to talk about the integration of people, process, and technology, because if you don't have all three in place, there's going to be real challenges within the organization in being a truly secure organization. If you look at security solutions where you don't have people, processes, and technology in alignment, there is no defense. You're not making an effort. But if you're only putting a process in place, or you're only putting a piece of technology in place and you're not getting people to buy in behind that and really start to use it, really start to leverage it, make sure that they are following the processes that you've defined, making sure that they're using the technology in the way that you want them to, you're going to run into just continuous issues. So it's truly crucial. And I would think probably the most important part of this is to get buy-in from the executive team. When people see, an organization trying to make a push towards technology and it's somewhat inconvenient to them in some way, it's a change and it's a different way of doing things, they resist. And if they see that the CEO of the organization is not doing it, or the chief financial officer or someone in the executive team isn't doing it because it's inconvenient to them, that's going to cause the whole organization to resist implementing secure policies and secure technology. So it's crucial that the executive team champion security initiatives and that they identify if there is poor adoption, why is there poor adoption? Let's see how we can change it. Let's see how we can improve it so that it's not such an inconvenience to the organization and becomes widely adopted and fully implemented and has the technology to support the initiative. It has the processes. It has people actually following. So outcomes. A risk assessment should be a roadmap. It should identify, these are the risks that we have. These are the scores of the risks. So something that is a high score, even if it is unlikely to happen, because it's that high score, that should be a priority. And so we assign a value to every risk that's identified, every concern that's identified, and make a roadmap of we've identified these gaps, now we're going to start closing them, and putting dates and putting budget towards this is what it's going to take to close this risk, this vulnerability for us, and this is when we want to do it, and develop the plan as to how we're going to achieve that, when we're going to achieve that, and make it measurable. So it gives you a tool to understand what your environment is, and it gives you a plan to protect yourselves.
Okay, and for those wanting CPE, here's your third question. Michelle, let me know when we're good to resume. All right, Chris, back to you.
Okay. So, in talking about our well-designed cybersecurity solution, there's a lot of different components that go into cybersecurity solutions. I would just point out that the security assessment, the risk assessment, is the first part of it. You really can't effectively create a cybersecurity solution without first identifying the risks and identifying what part of the, what aspects of your organization are at risk and what value there is in closing those gaps. Other components are certainly important, and we're seeing, we've gone from the traditional, passwords and maybe antivirus and a firewall. Now we're looking at security awareness training for end users, which is crucially important in this world of phishing. Advanced endpoint detection and response, that's EDR or XDR. Cyber insurance policies used to never even be a thing, and now it's in huge demand. Needing to protect the company against cyber vulnerabilities and the financial implications of those. And with those cyber insurance applications, there's also a major push back from the cyber insurance providers to say, okay, we need you to do a better job of identifying what the risks are and mitigating those risks. So it goes right back to running your risk assessment and doing that periodic review, identifying the risks and quantifying them. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the backup and disaster recovery plan, because this is often something that I've seen sort of glossed over by organizations where they'll say, okay, well, we have a backup system and so we're good. And it's really important in an organization for controlling risk to identify a specific recovery plan. First off, it's important to have a policy, so defining your recovery objectives. If a system stops working for whatever reason, what is the business impact? What is the amount of time it takes to get that system back online? And if we have to lose data as part of this because the system went down, what's the farthest point backwards in time that we can tolerate if there's data loss? So it may be that a business can tolerate a 4-hour downtime. So that would be your recovery point or your recovery time objective would be, it has to be back up and working in 4 hours. It may be half an hour, but it's important to define that and then make sure that you have a system in place that can achieve that being back online within 10 minutes or 4 hours or 8 hours or whatever your objective is. The recovery point objective is, if there is data loss, how far back can we tolerate? Is it 24 hours? Is it 10 minutes? The answer to that is going to drive whether or not your backup solution is appropriate to the organization's needs. Again, it's crucial to define and quantify the criticality of applications, and if there are dependencies. If one application won't work unless another is working, that needs to be defined and understood, and then a plan needs to be created around, if this service stops functioning, then what steps need to be done to bring that service back online, and what dependent systems need to be brought on first before this application can be brought online. Another big part that's often overlooked is understanding the licensing around software. I've had a lot of clients that their backup is brought online and they run into the problem of, oh, it's detected a change in hardware and now you can't use it until you go back to the vendor and get licensing. So understanding what the licensing requirements are when you're in a disaster scenario, and then understanding how to get that licensing is crucially important, and then documenting the process. So any risk assessment should include a disaster recovery plan or policy, disaster recovery plan, and then testing of that plan to make sure that you understand all of the implications of, if we have to execute this in a true disaster, how does it actually happen? What are we going to need to expect? And how can we mitigate around that? the other crucial part of that is defining who is in charge of what. So is there a team or an individual who's going to be doing the disaster recovery technical execution? There needs to be somebody who's communicating with management, somebody who's communicating with clients, somebody who's communicating with the public, depending on the organization's needs. That all should be laid out so that in the event that an actual disaster happens, everybody knows what their role is, what to expect, how to execute, and has a plan. So when Vertilocity does recovery testing, that's typically what we would do. We would review the plan that exists, make sure that a plan does exist. We would perform various recovery scenarios, restoring a file, restoring an entire device, booting up from the backup just to make sure that everything boots up and starts, identifying any driver issues, startup issues that would happen, restoring a backup, make sure that it works on premise, make sure it works in our cloud backup environment. You should always have, they say backups in 3 places, 1 on premise and 2 offsite is the general industry best practice for backing up data. You want to make sure that your backups work both from the on-premise and the off-site locations. So we would bring up the environment locally, bring it up in the cloud, distribute whatever clients are necessary to connect to that environment to our testers. That also gives us the opportunity to understand, okay, we need to get this client and get it out to users. How do we do that in a disaster scenario? Ensure everything is configured the way that we planned it to be configured, and then work with the users to test it and work with the users to document these are the steps that we had to do, these are the issues that we encountered, review that with management, update the documentation for next time. Policies. When we're doing risk assessment, there are a myriad of policies, and I won't read them all to you, but it is very important as we look at the risks to the organization that we ask, is it appropriate for us to have some of these policies, all of these policies? Are there policies that we should develop that we don't have right now? And I think most organizations, honestly, the answer would be yes, especially in the small and medium business space. There are a lot of policies that are, I think, assumed rather than defined, and that is exposing organizations to additional risk. And I believe Justin was going to take this next section.
So, what is cybersecurity culture? Essentially, this is, the organization, right? The people within the organization, their behaviors, how they're using technology with the thought of cybersecurity in that component to everything that they're doing in their day-to-day, right? So it's really the idea of embedding security and taking a defensive posture, right, when working. So, we want to make sure that individuals are cognizant when they're checking emails, when they're sending information, when they're accessing websites, right? It's just that recurring training in really informing of staff, both new and maybe more tenured individuals, as to processes, expectations, present day threats, what to be concerned with, what to be cognizant of, so that they are properly armed, right, with the tools to be able to recognize threats, or at least have that inkling that, hey, maybe there is something wrong here. This doesn't feel right. This seems a little bit fishy. I'm going to raise my hand and ask a question, or notify the proper individuals internally, rather than just assuming that it's safe and clicking on it, or sending information, or changing banking, routing information, things of that nature. So, it's, again, just continuous education and baking that into every process within the organization. So, knowledges, beliefs, perceptions, attitudes. Again, these are all the values and components that you want to have within, your staff as it relates to cybersecurity.
And for those of you looking for CP, if this is the toughest question of all, but just let us know yes or no. If you say yes, we'll send you the certificate, assuming that you answered the previous three. Michelle, let me know when it's safe to go on. All right, Justin, back to you.
All right, and I think I've kind of beat this one into the ground, right? But why do I need to do this again, right? Again, just to reiterate, the ever evolving threat landscape, right? Think about your processes and attacks from 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 2 years ago, right? Gone are the days of hey, I'm a Krentz and I've got $10 million and just send me all of your information and I'll transfer 5% of it to your account, right? I mean, these bad actors, are operating like a business, right? They're trying to find unique ways to gain access. They're socially engineering. They're using the information that's available at their disposal. So the threat landscape in process by which they're trying to gain access or gain information is ever evolving. So, as does the defense, right, to combat them. Changes in business objectives or model, right? Workforce being dispersed. I think we're all taking advantage of the ability that, you've got a larger pool and a larger reach in terms of really talented individuals, given, technology and advancements and the ability to work from home, right? So that's changing the landscape of businesses. That's changing how we're operating. That's changing how we're accessing data. Changes in infrastructure. If you haven't already gone to the cloud in some capacity, I'm sure it's in the roadmap. So what does that mean for security? Changes in resources, as I mentioned, consolidating roles, changes in terms of needs and expectations of resources and staff and their involvement with technology. It all kind of flows into your cyber roadmap, right? So being able to pivot, adjust, be nimble, and have the assessment to support what it is that you need to be doing from that aspect really all ties this together. So again, just to really reiterate, know where you stand and never become complacent. Right? Businesses, threat landscape, security, this is all changing. This isn't a one and done event, as we already mentioned. You really need to make a point to go through this exercise on a minimum at an annual basis, if not more frequently, because it becomes stale, it becomes irrelevant as time passes and things change, both with the business and the threat landscape, externally. And with that, Bill, I guess we'll open it up to questions. I'm not sure if we've fielded any thus far, but I think we've got a few minutes left here. So
I think we do have a couple minutes left. Michelle, any questions that have come in when you've been monitoring?
Yes, the one question that came in is, have you seen a greater need for risk assessments recently?
I'll take the first crack at that, and then I'll turn it over to you guys. But I would say the answer to that question, Michelle, would be a definite yes. As Chris and Justin were pointing out, I think it was Chris that was talking about the cyber insurance that used to be a nothing, and now it's a big deal. Well, I mean, one of my roles here at HBK is I'm the lucky guy that gets to fill out the cybersecurity insurance application. So I can tell you that those applications used to just be a couple pages long, and now they're about 10 to 15 pages long, and they ask real pointed questions like, do you do an annual risk assessment? So I would say the answer would be definitely that we're seeing a greater need for risk assessments. And Justin and Chris, I'll throw it your way and see what what things you've been experiencing.
Yeah, Bill, I mean, I would have to agree with you, right? Cyber insurance is a great indicator, right? Because they kind of set the stage for what they expect, and that's always changing. But also, I mean, if you just look at the trajectory, right, in most businesses and usage of technology and how much more really it's integrated into every single process and will continue to do so, really just supports the thought that, hey, we need to constantly evaluate and make sure that we understand our blind spots and our vulnerabilities, and we've got processes in place so that the organization isn't susceptible to attacks. And again, depending on what industry you're in, there's frameworks or compliance standards that you have to adhere to as well. So there's really potential financial implications that tie into this as well. Ensuring that you guys are properly protected and meeting all of those standards, but also just, again, mitigating your risk and exposure. In most organizations, right, their greatest asset is their reputation. So, you want to do whatever you can to ensure that that doesn't fall into the wrong hands. So we certainly aren't seeing less technology, in organizations. It's only going to continue to become more and more prevalent, right, and ingrained into processes. So, this isn't going away.
Right. Cool. Great. Thanks. Michelle, any other questions come in?
That is all for right now.
Okay, great. Well, I'd like to thank everybody again for joining us today, and especially thank Justin and Chris. I'll stick with my initial assessment that I had 2 experts on the live today. So I really want to thank both Chris and Justin for helping us out today and providing some real valuable information. And like I said, we'll be sending out copies of the slide deck and the recording. And we'll also put our contact information in that as well. If you have think of any questions after the fact, you can reach out to myself, Justin, or Chris. And I'd just like to close by saying that our next webinar is going to be on June 28th at 10 a.m. And we're going to be talking about the annual Verizon data breach investigation report, which is a good source of information to use when you do your own internal risk assessments. It kind of lets you know what's going on in the wild out there. So thanks again to Chris and Justin, and thanks to everybody joining us today, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.